Hello, media theory people, and welcome to another short lecture. For today, we're going to talk about Louis Althusser and his writing about ISA and RSAs, or rather the ISAs and the RSAs. So, uh, hopefully you'll see once we get into the lecture a little bit today that Althusser and Gramsci are really kind of closely related, which is why I put these readings together. Both are European philosophers in essence, and both are Marxist philosophers. And so Althusser was French, whereas Gramsci was Italian. And like Gramsci, Althusser was a member of the French Communist Party. And Althusser was kind of an interesting character. Um, he studied and wrote about philosophy throughout his life, although and specialized again in kind of a Marxist perspective or specialized in, let's say, Marxist critical theory. Although by the end of his life, he had admitted to folks at one point that he never read any Marx, or at least claimed to have never read any Marx, even though this was his specialty throughout his life. He had some emotional and psychological difficulties. He later in his life choked his wife to death. But of course, because he was a French intellectual, he never went to jail for it. Being an intellectual in France is different than being an intellectual here in the United States. They respect intellectuals in Europe. Uh, and you get certain privileges, amongst which apparently are being able to strangle your wife to death. But that's neither here nor there. What's important are his theories. So, as we learned in our study of Gramsci and hegemony, hegemony or right ruling power is it's constantly negotiated. Just because you get power doesn't mean that you'll keep it. And indeed, Gramsci told us that hegemony is achieved in two ways. This is what he's famous for. Is telling us about the idea that hegemony is achieved through power, through hard power, you know, through a gun, and also through the manufacturing of consensus, or getting people to willingly agree with what you're doing, agreeing to be led to a certain extent, right? And so Althusser's ideas are closely related. Althusser, like Gramsci, is interested in ideology. And this idea that ideology represents the ideas of the working class, and that the ruling class, and that it exists to perpetuate a system where the ruling class rules the working class and keeps this system going in perpetuity, right? So Althusser uh, takes a look at this and he says, he's curious about how ideology is spread and how it functions, and he says, well, it's basically maintained through two different apparatuses, right, or systems, and so he divides these up between the RSA and ISAs. So the RSA, which is the first one we'll talk about, is the repressive state apparatus. And so Althusser looks at the state, meaning the government at large, as a repressive apparatus, which is used by the ruling class as a tool to suppress and dominate the working class. So, according to this idea, the basic function of the RSA, the repressive state apparatus, is to intervene and act in favor of the ruling class by repressing the ruled class by violent and coercive means. So this should sound familiar. This is the idea that hegemony is at least partially achieved, or hegemonic power is at least partially achieved uh, with a gun, right? And so for Althusser, this hard power, if you will, is represented by the government, by the state, and specifically by agents of the state like police, the justice system, the army, etc. Right? And so the RSA, which is ultimately controlled by the ruling class, right, expresses itself through hard power in the form of government institutions, again, like the police or the justice system, which puts people in jail, or the military, where in the U.S. at least, the military is sometimes called upon to, in the form of the National Guard, to rein in the citizenry, right, when they get out of control. The National Guard, for example, is called in during the time of riots to help as kind of a police force, right? And so Althusser says this is one of the ways that the state maintains power, right, is through its hard power systems. The other half of this is the ISA, or ideological state apparatuses. Now, for Gramsci, the repressive state apparatus is really one thing. There are a bunch of different elements to it, again, like police, courts, military, etc. But it's ultimately all part of the government, so it's one thing. Ideological state apparatuses, however, are a series of different apparatuses, right, that are usually not government related. And so they come in a lot of different forms. So religion, church, for example, is an ideological state apparatus for Althusser. The family is an ideological state apparatus. He talks about the communications ISA. That would be, your broadcasters, your cable networks, your newspapers, right? All these things are not government agencies, but nevertheless, they're all still ideological apparatuses to the extent that they perpetuate the ruling ideas, right? They send out the ideological messaging that people absorb. He says they're also cultural ISAs, right? Things like literature, art, sports. These are all, again, for Althusser, apparatuses or systems that spread ideology, specifically the ideology of the ruling class. And so these entities operate via soft power, right? These are the things, and in a way, it's the fact that they're soft power that make them more insidious or more effective. If someone's sticking a gun in your face, it's pretty obvious that they want something from you, right? Hard power is easy to identify. It's easy to identify what the hard power wants and what the limits are and so on. And it's also easy to be resentful towards hard power, as we've seen in this country with the large movements to defund the police and so on, right? I mean, these are people directly rebelling against hard power. But with ideological state apparatuses, this is soft power. And the way they work, sometimes we don't even notice. And so as a result, this makes them far more effective in a sense. And again, more insidious. This is the ideology that permeates your life and surrounds you that you're oftentimes not even aware of. It's the ISAs that in a sense make ideology common sense, because you're surrounded by these things constantly. And indeed, the ISAs, if we go back to the notions of base and superstructure that we spoke of in the last lecture, the ISAs operate within the superstructure, right? The base is the economic conditions that then inform culture. And culture, to Althusser, is made up of these ideological state apparatuses. So how does that work, you ask, right? Well, there are messages being sent by all these different institutions. So the religious ISA, for example, if we look at something like the Catholic Church has a very clearly defined hierarchy. There's a dominance hierarchy within the church itself. It defines itself in familial terms. So the priest is father, nuns are sisters, monks and so on are brothers. And parishioners are children, basically, right? And you understand then from this framework, from this familial framework, that there's a clear power structure here in terms of who's in charge and who should be listened to, right? The family indeed operates the same kind of way. So in the traditional nuclear family structure with a mom and dad and kids, we see that the dad is oftentimes in charge, followed by the mother, followed by the children, right? And this kind of patriarchal familial system then sets the basis from the time you're born for an understanding of the world that says that men are dominant, right? Women are subordinate to that. And of course, then children are subordinate still to women. So these power structures, just in living through them, right, give us an idea about how the world is supposed to work, or how it should work, quote unquote, and naturally, right? They make the whole idea behind ideology is it makes these ideas seem natural. And one of the ways you do that is by having people grow up in these environments, in the church, in a family, reading the newspapers, watching TV, right? Reading literature, watching sports. Sports perhaps is a good example. So if we watch football or baseball, basketball, there's this idea that if you work hard enough and you train hard enough, you'll get ahead and you'll be rewarded for it. And winning is something we should do at all costs, right? And these ideas closely match the ideology of capitalism, of course, right? There's an idea in this country that's less prevalent now than it was when I was a kid, but nevertheless is still prevalent. There's an idea in this country that if you work hard, you'll be rewarded, full stop, right? Now, we can debate whether or not this is true. I know plenty of people who have worked hard their whole lives and have never gotten ahead. I know people, for example, who've worked as janitors who work their asses off, but have never received large financial rewards, have never been really secure in terms of being able to support their families and so on. But nevertheless, the idea that no matter what you do, if you work hard at it, you'll do well in capitalism. If you just pull yourself up by the bootstraps, right? This is the whole idea behind it. That's an ideology, right? And it's an ideology that, of course, supports the winners, because in theory, they're the ones who worked harder. Now, you and I know that this may not be the case, right? Certainly, there are lots of children of wealthy people who are wealthy themselves who never worked a day in their lives. But this isn't the sort of thing that's represented in our ideological state apparatuses, right? Our ideological state apparatuses, like sports, make you think, oh, if I train hard enough, if I work hard enough, I'll be rewarded, I'll get ahead, right? And it feeds you, it trains you and then feeds you directly into a capitalist system that celebrates this ideology and in theory makes you a really good worker for the people who are the true capitalists, the people who own everything and who, the one percenters, in other words, right? So again, these apparatuses function through ideology. No one's holding a gun to your head. No one's telling you what you have to do. They're just conditioning you in a way in order to become good capitalist citizens. So some differences between the two. So again, the RSA, the RSA, the repressive state apparatus, functions as a unified entity. So it's an organized whole. It's usually represented by government. Now, with ISAs, there are a lot of them, right? There are all kinds of different ISAs. There's, again, the family, newspapers, schools, right? All these different things that indoctrinate you. So ISAs are plural. The RSA is singular. It's one large organization. However, what unites the ISAs, even though there are many different forms, right, is the fact that they're ultimately controlled by the ruling ideology. So even though the church and the school are two different things, and the people from the school don't meet with the people from the church, what makes them the same, what makes them part of this organization, or part of this apparatus, is the idea that they're both controlled by the ruling ideology. They both serve the ruling class, right? So, and again, another big difference, the repressive state apparatus, the RSA, functions predominantly by means of repression and violence. Again, think about the police. If you step out of line, if you break the rules, they come to your house, they pull guns, they give you some stick time with the billy clubs, right? That's the repressive state apparatus. Do what I say or else. The ISA is different because it's all about ideology, right? It always functions by ideology first, and if there is any repression and violence, it's really kind of subordinate to ideology. So when we think about schools, there was a time where corporal punishment was common in American schools. That corporal punishment is a euphemism for spanking kids with a paddle. Uh, so, even though the school would be deemed an ISA, right, there's still some element of repression and violence if you're beating the kids when they get out of line, right? So the ISA ultimately, or the ISAs, I should say, function in a concealed and symbolic manner. So in a way that you don't really notice, right? Again, it's much easier to see how the police or the National Guard or the court system works to enforce the rules in the interests of the rich and powerful than it is to see how a nursery school does the same thing. Although for Althusser, arguably, they are kind of the same thing. Now, in another part of the reading, Althusser talks about what he sees to be the dominant ISA in capitalist social formations. So, by capitalist social formation, he means economies like ours, capitalist systems. And he's looking at the changes that have occurred over time in the various social systems. And he says, the church was the dominant ideological state apparatus for a long period of time. And you should remember that the Catholic Church was arguably the dominant world power for well over 1,000 years in the West, in Western civilization. So the church really was the place where everybody went at least once a week to go and get their ideological messages served up to them by the priests and so on, bishops, pope, etc., right? However, as we move to an industrial society and we've become increasingly secular in terms of our society as a whole, what has happened then is that the school, the public school, for example, in the United States, has replaced the church as the primary form of, or dominant form of ideological state apparatus. And in this context, Althusser observes it takes children from every class at infant school age, and then for years, the years in which the child is most vulnerable, squeezed between the family state apparatus and the educational state apparatus. It drums into them, whether it uses new or old methods, a certain amount of know-how, quote unquote, wrapped in the ruling ideology. So, I suggested to you in a previous lecture when I showed you the photograph of the kids with their hands over their heart saying the Pledge of Allegiance. This is clearly a form of ideological education, right? I'm not sure at all that it's reasonable to put your hand over your heart and stand up and pledge yourself to a flag. Indeed, that seems like a very silly idea to me. It's slightly less silly if you think about it as, pledging yourself to the republic for which it stands. Pledge yourself to a country is a little different. But even in that context, it's kind of strange, right? Why would you pledge yourself to the republic? What is the republic? Right? What is the United States of America? And I ask that question seriously. What is a country? Well, it's some borders that are arbitrary, right? I mean, there's no physical borders. If I go to Canada, there is no wall between us and Canada. I can just step over to the other side, right? So it's an arbitrary border. And what do we have in common as Americans? What do I have in common with a 14-year-old Eskimo girl in Anchorage, Alaska? The answer, I suggest to you, is very little. um, you know, other than the fact that we're both Americans. And what that means in and of itself, I'm not really sure. I mean, we're governed by similar laws, and we both have to pay taxes. Beyond that, though, our life experience is probably utterly different. So when I pledge myself to a country, what am I pledging myself to? Well, I mean, arguably an idea. So when we have kids do this, right? I mean, we're having them pledge themselves to an idea, an ideology, a way of thinking that's inextricably mixed up with capitalism as an economic system, right? You couldn't have the United States of America to an extent without capitalism. And so you see how this all becomes complicated. We go to school at a certain time in the morning. You clock into school, you clock out of school in essence, right? You change classes according to a set schedule. You all eat in one place. I mean, it's as if, in a sense, that the school is training you for the world of work. Show up at a certain period of time, work a certain number of hours, take a timed lunch break, right? I mean, the school is, in a very real sense, a kind of factory for the production of workers. And it's this component of it that Althusser looks at and says, well, this is obviously the dominant ISA in capitalist social formations. It's making young kids into future workers, right? To serve the one percenters, to serve the ruling class. Now, that isn't to say that the kids of the ruling class don't go to school too. They do. But these are different schools, right? Yale and Harvard are a long way from Georgia State. Something to think about, right? So again, we teach kids in elementary school ethics. We teach them about civics. We had civics courses when I was a kid, where you're literally training them to be citizens, right? You don't train them about ideology, but you train them to be citizens. And so this, in a way, again, makes kids ready to perpetuate this system, to maintain the status quo, to keep things the way they are, moving forever into the future, because they're the next generation of workers, right? They're the next generation of workers that will forward this system and be exploited by the capitalists in charge. So then, what is ideology? We've talked about ideology a lot. Well, ultimately, there's several theses concerning ideology that Althusser expresses, and he says thesis one is that ideology represents the imaginary relationship of individuals to the real conditions of existence. So let's unpack this. Ideology represents the imaginary relationship of individuals to the real conditions of existence. So what he's talking about here is, in a way, the same kind of false consciousness that I talked about in the lecture on Gramsci. That is, ideology blinds you to your current circumstances. How does it do that? Well, for example, in a capitalist system like ours, people are always forward-looking, right? If I work really hard, I might get a raise next quarter, or I might get a really big Christmas bonus. And when I get that Christmas bonus, I'll be able to afford a new place to live. I'll be able to afford a nicer apartment, right? So by focusing on the future, and by focusing on what you might get if you work harder, for example, you're not thinking about how crappy your apartment and your life are now, right? It blinds you to the real conditions of your existence. You don't understand, for example, that when you go to work, when I was a kid, my father told me, put in a hard day's work, and if you go give it your all, you'll do well. And an employer will want you around, and they won't fire you, and they'll protect you and take care of you as long as you give them your all, right? Well, that kind of idea, of course, belies the fact that as hard as you work, the capitalist that you're working for is exploiting you. So you don't even realize that for your full day's work, you're not getting paid the value of that day's work, right? The capitalist can't possibly pay you for the full value of your day's work, or else the capitalist wouldn't make any profits, right? Your work, by definition, has to be worth less than what you get for it. So if you work all week and you make $20,000 worth of goods, the capitalist is going to pay you $10,000. And right away, you've been exploited, right? Right away, you're not doing an honest day's work and getting an honest day's wage. You're doing an honest day's work and getting half the wage, right? And it's ideology, that idea, that saying, put in a full day's work at a full day's wage. That's ideology, right? That's this idea that this is the way it's supposed to work. Why wouldn't you just work for yourself and get all of the money that's due to you? Right? I mean, that's the question that you should ask in that scenario. So ideology, again, it represents this imaginary relationship you have to the real conditions of your existence. You don't realize that you're being exploited. You don't realize how crappy your life is because you're looking into the future and what you might have later on, instead of realizing where you're at right here and now. So that's the first thesis. The second thesis is that ideology actually has a material existence. And so what Althusser means by this is the idea that ideology exists in the apparatuses themselves. So the church, the school, these are physical places, right? Material places, buildings with people and desks and all these things, right? And that these institutions, I mean, even Georgia State, if you go there and you look at it, right, you're looking at the material existence of ideology when you're walking around that campus. Right? It's an actual material thing. It's not just an idea. It's a whole physical place, a whole physical world. And indeed, some theorists like Zizek, for example, have taken the idea of ideology even a step further and in essence argued that ideology represents the very fabric of your reality. It's not just a lens that you look through and see the world in this kind of, fake way or distorted way. For some thinkers, they say ideology is the world that you see. And that by definition, you can never get out of it. Kind of like the Matrix, right? Where Keanu Reeves, gets offered the pills. You can take the red one or the blue one, and one of them lets you see how the world really is. Well, that's a commentary on ideology. But some thinkers would say, well, you can't even take the pill to see it, right? I mean, even as I'm sitting here with you now describing ideology, some people would say, Eric, it's fine you're describing it, but you're stuck in it yourself. And this description is stuck in it, and there's, it's hopeless. You're never actually able to step out of it, right? Which is depressing, but might be true. So one of the ways, or one of the things that Althusser is interested in terms of ideology is how does it trap you? How does it suck you in, right? How does ideology make you what we call a subject? How do you become subject to the ideology? And so he says, I suggest that ideology acts or functions in such a way that it recruits people, right? Or transforms, right, the people that it brings in through a process known as interpolation or hailing. So interpolation is a fancy word, but what it really means is just that you're calling out to someone, right? You're hailing someone, like you hail a cab, you hail somebody. And the example he gives is someone walking down the street, right? And there's a policeman there, and the policeman yells out, hey, you there. And you turn around. That second that you turn around, right? That second that you realize that the police officer is talking to you, you've been recruited into ideology. You've become a subject to that ideology, right? That's the repressive state apparatus that calls to you and you respond. And the second you respond, you become part of it. You become subject to it. You become assimilated into it, right? It's, I mean, in a more vulgar example I might give you, If you're in a crowd and someone yells, "Hey, asshole," and you turn around, you're the asshole, right? I mean, you've acknowledged that you are. That's why you turned around. You see? And ideology works the same way. And so what it does is it hails you. Ideology hails you. And it's not just the policeman who hails you, right? You're constantly being hailed by billboards, by advertisements on social media, by the TV programs that suck you in, by the news stories and headlines that you see. It's everywhere, right? Ideology is everywhere because remember, the ideological state apparatuses are legion. They're everywhere. And so they're constantly hailing you, and you have no choice but to respond to some of them. And as soon as you do, by turning around, by paying attention, by acknowledging this call, you become subject to the ideology. You're part of it. And indeed, in a sense, I'll point out to you too that ideology functions on you even before you're born. Right? I mean, you're in the womb and your parents decide, oh, well, we got to make a nursery for baby, right? Well, if it's a boy, they paint it blue. If it's a girl, they paint it pink. That's ideological, right? I mean, that's a whole system that's worked out. You're not even born yet, and when you get here, they painted your room a particular color because it matches your gender, right? They put you into a system, into an apparatus. They name you, right? My parents named me Eric. They could have named me, Killer Joe, right, or some shit, and arguably I'd be a much different person, right? I mean, if I give you a regular everyday name, then right away I've already kind of assimilated you into society. Think about what names mean too. Think about what you expect from your child when you name them. Parents buy books about this shit. They sit around and debate about what to name their child, right? And the reason they debate it is because they know how ideologically important it is. This is the name that people will be using to hail you, right, throughout your life. And they think about it like, I mean, and names come in and out of style, of course. But I mean, a parent who names their kid like Snurdly, right? I mean, they got to know that the kid's screwed, that's going to be a nerd. Um, Likewise, if I name my kid, if I have a baby girl and I name her Cinnamon, it's pretty much a foregone conclusion that she's going to be a stripper, right? You see what I'm saying? I mean, I'm making jokes, I'm exaggerating, but hopefully you understand my points. That ideology is always working on you. You're always part of this system. You can't really get out of it. The best you can hope for is by reading something like Althusser or Gramsci and being able to step back a little bit and gain some perspective on things and say, whoa, man, maybe the school really is like preparing me for the factory or for work. And maybe I should be careful because maybe it's not in my best interest. Maybe the military in visiting high schools is just trying to suck me in to go fight wars that benefit other people. So maybe I should pay attention to that. Or, any number of things, right? Or maybe by going to church and or Catholic school, the nuns beating me with, rulers, maybe that prepares me for a boss later in life, right? That I'll be obsequious to and kiss their ass so in order not to make any problems. Again, this kind of Marxist philosophy in theory, is dark. It at times seems to border on conspiracy theory. It's powerful, it's interesting, but it's also problematic in its own ways, right? It's easy to sit back and be lazy and say, oh, well, the system's rigged against me, everybody's just training me to exploit me, and so on. That's very easy to say if you don't want to work hard and you feel like you haven't achieved anything in life, and instead of taking responsibility for that yourself, you blame a system. So I'm not, by any means a crazed Marxist, even though I've been accused of such. I'm wary of Marxist philosophy, but it does offer us a powerful tool for critiquing social systems and the way they operate, and in trying to understand why people do things, particularly why poor people do things that aren't in their own best interests. So one final example, perhaps, my wife's family doesn't have a lot of money. They're working class, not really educated beyond high school. Some of the folks didn't finish high school and have worked in factories their whole lives. But nevertheless, when they vote in such a way that hurts them, right? They vote conservative, and they vote in ways that do not benefit them, that indeed hurt them, right? So, in talking to one member of my wife's family who needs really expensive medicine every month, I was talking to him about socialized medicine. He says, "Oh, that's some communist bullshit. I'd never vote for anybody who wants socialized medicine or, single payer." And I thought to myself, well, that's crazy because you need it because you're broke, right? And you need this medicine to live, and it's $300 a month. And that's costing you a lot of money. But the reason I think he feels that way is because largely of ideology, because he watches Fox News all the time, because he listens to conservative radio, because he reads conservative newspapers, because he's bought into this whole idea that the free market way is better, even though it costs him thousands of dollars and may eventually cost him his life, right? He's not aware of how shitty his life is because, in a sense, he's operating with a false consciousness, right? Maybe that sounds rude or judgmental, and I don't mean it to be that way. It's just is what it is, right? But I think it gives you a good idea of how this works. So as I've explained to you before, the family ISA, for example, is at work on you even before you're born. And in a sense, you're what we would call always already a subject. So you're already subject to ideology, and there's nothing you can do about it, right? You're always part of this system. And then as you make your way through the world, as you grow up and so on, you go through various levels of subjugation, or subjection rather. And you go through a series of ISAs that subject you to different kinds of influences, right? And they influence you on the deepest level, on the level of day-to-day activity, right? So we talk a lot about theory and theoretical ideas, but theory is just navel-gazing unless it matters in your everyday life. And what Althusser is saying here is, listen, as you go through these ISAs, these are the ISAs, these are the apparatuses, the systems that constitute your everyday life. The family, the school, the Little League, the football practice, right? All these things, your job. These are the things that hit you where you live. These are the things that determine your real conditions of existence. And so as a result, Althusser takes this even a step further, and he says that recognition of yourself as a free subject, if you think that you're truly free, right? Land of the free, home of the brave. If you think that you're truly free in the sense that you can do what you want to do and so on, Althusser says this is a misrecognition. You're mistaken. You're not really free. You never are, because you've been subjected to this ideology from before day one, right? So in reality, the subject is subjugated, limited, restricted, and controlled by ideology to such an extent that he or she has limited freedom and little individual agency. So even when you do make up your mind, even when you do try and make choices, the choices that seem available to you are defined by ideology. I've spoken to students before about revolution, right? Because of course Marx thought that we'd have a communist revolution here in the United States eventually. And I've talked to them about this, and they laugh about it. I say, well, if you're a Marxist, go get your gun at Walmart and go to the North Georgia mountains and set up and make some revolution, right? And everybody laughs. And the reason that they laugh is because this seems ridiculous. But it really is an option, right? I mean, that's the other side of the coin is, yes, it seems ridiculous. I'm not about to do it. If I went to the mountains and started a revolution, I wouldn't be able to watch Game of Thrones on Sunday night, right? But at the same time, it's still a real idea. It just doesn't seem, or a real choice. It just doesn't seem like a potential choice, right? That doesn't mean that you can't do it. You can. And so due to this misrecognition, the subject acts and practices rituals steeped in the dominant ideology that are detrimental to his or her own welfare. We vote for politicians who don't represent our interests because we've been sucked into to an ideology. We believe that the rich have worked harder than we have and deserve everything they have, and as a result, don't go take it from them. Uh, we believe that people in this country should have hundreds of billions of dollars, which is ludicrous when you, on its face, right? The idea that someone is actually worth hundreds of billions of dollars, more money than they could ever spend in a lifetime, more money than their children could ever spend in a lifetime. It's crazy. But we think of someone like Jeff Bezos, right? Amazon was a great idea and he worked really hard, so he deserves it. Well, maybe, or maybe he doesn't. Maybe you should only be allowed to have like $10 billion and the rest should be used for better things. You can only sail so many yachts at once. All right, so didn't mean to bum you out, but that is Althusser in a nutshell. If you have any questions, be sure to hit me up, and thanks for checking out my video.